Welcome to Sinister States.
I remember the exact moment everything went wrong, or maybe the exact moment everything finally became real. I was staring at the glowing screen of my GPS, watching the blue dot that had guided me through countless back roads, logging trails, and forgotten service roads, when it blinked. Just one flicker. Then it vanished. 1 second I had coordinates, altitude, the comforting hum of satellites confirming my position. The next, nothing. My phone began a slow, desperate shuffle between loading icons, spinning wheels, and that infuriating message, signal lost, recalculating, over and over. Tap after tap produced the same useless loop, the blue dot frozen mid-forest, a cruel, mocking punctuation against the thick green of the Appalachian ridges. It's hard to describe what that feels like until it happens to you. The world you thought was governed by invisible satellites and constant connectivity, phones, radios, emergency services, vanishes. You realize you're completely untethered. The digital pulse you've trusted for years disappears, leaving behind only the raw, tactile world, the uneven ground under your boots, the heavy scent of pine needles and decaying wood, the uncanny silence that seems too deep to be natural. I was standing on a ridge in a forest that doesn't exist on most maps, looking down a logging road overrun with brambles and moss, and the first true weight of isolation pressed down on me. I tried calling out, more out of habit than hope, punching in numbers for local dispatch, the sheriff's office, even my own cell provider. Nothing. Not even static. My smartphone, a device that has carried me across continents, through mountain passes and deserts, now blinked at me like a stranger's face, entirely unresponsive, completely foreign. In that moment, the concept of a dead zone transformed from a theoretical curiosity into something tangible, suffocating, alive. This was no ordinary loss of signal. This was the wilderness asserting a boundary I wasn't supposed to cross. Somewhere deep in the hills, technology failed for a reason I could not yet understand. I fumbled through my pack and found the hand-drawn map I'd printed weeks before, the only remaining lifeline. It was crude, ink lines fading slightly where water had brushed against the paper, the trails and notations ambiguous at best. There were no color-coded elevations, no GPS coordinates, only landmarks marked by notes like old cabin, rocky gully, and stream with fallen bridge. I ran my fingers over the contours of roads that no modern map recognizes, feeling the connection between hand, paper, and terrain. It was a fragile tether to reality in a place where reality itself seemed negotiable. The forest around me was a cathedral of absence. I expected birdsong, the occasional snap of twigs from hidden deer, but there was nothing. No hum of distant traffic, no faint whir of a generator, no drone of satellites overhead. Only silence. And yet, the silence had weight. It pressed against my ears, amplified the sound of my own heartbeat, made the space between trees feel like a vacuum. Every step I took along the overgrown logging trail echoed in ways that were both intimate and alien. I realized I was hearing the forest differently, sensing its geometry with my skin and bones rather than my ears. I set up a small waypoint just off the main path, leaving a flagging ribbon to mark my position. The map told me where to go, but I knew the trust it commanded was conditional. Interpretation would be everything. One misread curve, one mistaken landmark, and I could wander deeper into territory from which no one could retrieve me. The dead zones of the Appalachians are notorious for this. Roads disappear under moss and fallen trees, streams shift after storms, and the topography itself seems to conspire against GPS tracking. Outside this small rectangle of familiarity, satellites are blind, emergency calls vanish into the static, and you are left alone with the ancient, sentient forest. I remember sitting on a fallen log, unzipping my pack, trying to calibrate my bearings with the map. I had brought a compass as a backup, but even that felt inadequate. The air was thick and damp, filled with the faint tang of soil and resin. Mist began to curl along the ridges, coiling into the hollows like smoke. Each exhale fogged in the cold mountain air. The sun was a distant, dying disk behind the pines, slanting light and sharp, disjointed angles through the skeletal branches. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, making the trees seem taller, denser, more threatening. I began to notice other things. The forest made its presence known in subtle ways. A branch would fall somewhere behind me with no apparent source. Leaves would shift in patterns that suggested movement, though nothing emerged when I looked closer. Even the ground seemed altered, as if my passage had been anticipated. My mind started to churn with the faintest sense of being observed, not in a paranoid, fleeting way, but in a deliberate, patient manner. I felt watched in a way that no camera, no satellite, no human companion could ever convey. My hand-drawn map became a kind of ritual. I spread it on the hood of my truck, traced the path ahead with my finger, whispered landmarks to myself, as if naming them could anchor them in reality. Stream crossing, fallen oak, ridge line. Each name was a talisman against disorientation. I photographed the map with my dead phone, not expecting it to help, but almost as a testament to the fragile line between preparation and recklessness. It was comforting and terrifying at the same time, a concrete object in a space defined by absence. By the time night began to settle fully over the ridges, the silence had grown almost unbearable. My own thoughts became louder than reality, echoing back at me in warped rhythms. I could feel the shift in perception. Colors dulled, sounds sharpened, shapes in the periphery seemed to bend. Even the comforting idea of sleep felt foreign, as though closing my eyes might allow the forest itself to reach in and claim me. And that's when I realized something truly fundamental about these dead zones. They are not merely places where technology fails. They are thresholds, boundaries between the world as you understand it and the world as it exists beyond human observation. In that space, your tools, your gadgets, your lifelines are meaningless. Only the mind, your senses, and whatever courage you can summon remain. I had prepared for this. I knew the signal would die. I knew I would be alone. But I was unprepared for the quality of silence, for the visceral understanding that the forest does not simply contain you. It notices, it adjusts, it watches. The hand-drawn map was my last connection to reason, my only route through a reality that had begun to warp and whisper around me. By the time I finally closed the hood of my truck and hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, the digital world was gone. There were no blue dots, no lines, no reassurance. There was only the path ahead, a fragile network of ink on paper, and the dense, patient gaze of the Appalachian wilderness. And I knew in the very marrow of my bones that crossing into that darkness alone was only the beginning. The road, or what passed for a road, was little more than a gash in the forest, a scar left by logging crews decades ago, now overrun with brambles, moss, and roots that had twisted themselves into natural speed bumps. I eased the truck forward, tires crunching against stones and splintered wood, my eyes darting between the faded lines on my hand-drawn map and the ever-tightening corridor of trees. Every turn felt precarious, like the forest itself was shifting to close in behind me, urging me back. The GPS remained dead, the phone a useless brick, and the silence of the woods pressed against the metal of the vehicle like a living thing. With each mile, the isolation thickened. I was leaving the last traces of civilization behind. No distant hum of a highway, no chirping cell towers, no lights flickering from cabins tucked into hollows. Just the muted symphony of dead leaves brushing against bark and the occasional thump of a branch snapping under unseen weight. The deeper I drove, the more the forest claimed the trail, until at some point it was no longer a path, but a suggestion, a series of lines on paper that might lead somewhere or might lead nowhere at all. I stopped when the ridge above me flattened out, a narrow clearing that seemed almost deliberate. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the pines, casting long skeletal shadows across the ground. It was the kind of light that makes everything uncertain, where shapes appear familiar for a moment, only to dissolve into ambiguity. I pulled the truck to a stop and climbed out, boots sinking into damp moss, and the first wave of the forest's oppressive quiet hit me like a physical weight. Setting up camp became both a necessity and a ritual. I unpacked motion-activated cameras I had brought along, placing them strategically around the clearing, pointing them toward the tree line. Each one clicked into place with a mechanical finality, its infrared sensors blinking faintly in acknowledgement. It was strange. I was recording the forest not for entertainment, but for survival, as though the cameras might bear witness to something that could not be captured by human memory alone. The sun dipped lower, bleeding gold and crimson through the canopy, and I felt the creeping awareness that night would be absolute here. The forest did not soften in darkness, it sharpened, becoming a living geometry of shadow and sound. As I moved around the perimeter, I noticed the first subtle, unnerving shifts in perception. Without the constant hum of electronics, the background noise of our modern lives, the mind begins to misfire in unexpected ways. A branch falling in the distance sounded unnervingly like deliberate footsteps. The rustle of leaves transformed into whispers. Even the wind felt personal, brushing against my skin with a caressing, almost inquisitive quality. I felt my own heartbeat spike, not from exertion, but from the sense that something was observing me, testing me, measuring how far I would go. I ran my hands over the rough bark of a nearby oak, grounding myself, reminding myself that this was real and not a hallucination. But the truth of the dead zones is that perception itself begins to fracture. Your senses turn traitor. Shadows lengthen unnaturally. Sounds echo in impossible ways. Your eyes catch movement that your mind cannot rationalize. I had trained for solitude, for tracking and navigation, for the physiological toll of isolation, but nothing prepared me for the deep, cellular unease that settles over you when you are cut entirely from the familiar signals of the world. I tried to steady myself, checking the cameras, reviewing the angles and distances. Each one blinked in the failing light, a small circle of certainty in a forest otherwise defined by ambiguity. I spoke aloud, naming the cameras as if their mechanical presence could anchor reality. Northridge, South Gap, Fallen Oak. My own voice sounded foreign, distorted by the heavy air, too loud in the absence of everything else. It echoed back at me in hollow rhythms, forcing me to confront the odd intimacy of the solitude. The map guided me onward, but with every step I could feel the forest reshaping the landscape in my mind. Landmarks twisted into unfamiliar forms. A ridge became a hollow, a fallen tree became a barricade. I caught myself hesitating at every fork, recalibrating constantly, aware that one wrong choice could strand me in territory from which no human eyes would ever recover me. I thought about the countless stories of hikers lost in these woods, people who vanished without a trace, and I realized that fear is not merely a byproduct of danger here, it is the forest's native language. You do not survive these dead zones by strength alone, but by understanding that the world itself is attentive, reactive, and patient. By the time night fell fully, I had finished setting up the camp, the cameras forming a weak lattice of observation around a small square of human habitation. I lit a small stove, the flame throwing long shadows over the clearing, and listened as the forest adjusted around me. Silence became more than the absence of sound. It was a presence. It pressed against me from all sides, weighted and deliberate, and in that silence I began to feel my own thought processes fray. I noticed it first in subtle ways. My breathing grew uneven, My attention flitted from the smallest detail to the largest, as if scanning for threats I could not identify. The absence of electronic hum, the constant, imperceptible vibration of human infrastructure left a void in my sensory experience, a void the forest began to fill with its own patterns. I kept checking my watch, my phone, even though I knew none of it mattered. Each tick seemed amplified in the stillness, a drumbeat marking my descent into an environment where the ordinary rules no longer applied. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted one of the cameras, the infrared light blinking a soft red like a heartbeat. It was comforting and disquieting at once. I realized that these devices were my only proof that I was not entirely alone, yet they could not protect me, could not intervene, could not comfort me. Then came the first audible anomaly. A snap, sharp and deliberate, broke the stillness somewhere beyond the tree line. I froze, straining my ears. Another snap, then a third, almost pacing, measured, circling the perimeter without revealing its source. My mind raced. Deer? A coyote? A branch under the weight of the wind? Maybe, but the rhythm, the precision felt deliberate. My chest tightened, adrenalizing me in a way that no physical exertion could. I adjusted my stance, gripping my flashlight and moving carefully to survey the area. Nothing moved in the beam, and yet I could feel it. The forest seemed aware, tracking, reacting. I sat down on a nearby boulder, forcing myself to breathe, to catalog what I saw and heard. I ran through every rational explanation, reminding myself that this was a natural environment, that sounds echo differently in deep valleys, that animals follow predictable patterns. But logic felt thin here. The absence of technology, the isolation, and the uncanny attentiveness of the forest combined to create a pressure that the mind cannot ignore. Even my own reflection in the truck's windshield seemed alien, too still, too bright against the shadowed world. By midnight, the forest had completed its initial survey of me. Every snap, every shift of shadow, every whisper of wind had been cataloged. I lay in my tent, listening through the thin fabric, counting the miles between perceived threats and the perimeter cameras. I realized that the descent into this void was not a physical one, it was psychological. The vehicle, the map, the cameras, they were scaffolds holding reality together, yet every scaffold felt as fragile as wet paper. My thoughts looped back on themselves, questioning every sound, every shape, every instinct. In that moment, I understood the fundamental rule of the Appalachian Dead Zones. The forest is not merely a place, but a presence. It perceives, it reacts, and it shapes the way you move, think, and survive. To cross these ridges is to enter a dialogue with something ancient and patient, to expose yourself to a world that knows no schedules, no coordinates, no deadlines. Technology can fail, maps can mislead, and yet the deeper truth is that you are the anomaly here, the one who does not belong. I stared at the ceiling of the tent, tracing the outline of the single mesh window that revealed the stars beyond. Even they seemed muted, distant, as if the dead zone had reached upward to dim the sky itself. I tried to imagine the world beyond this forest, the hum of cities, the light of civilization, but the memory felt thin, almost unreal. The forest, the trail, the cameras, they were all that existed, and the realization hit me like cold water. I was alone, completely, with only a map, a truck, and the patient, observing weight of the void pressing in from all sides. By the third night, I had begun to notice the first real fractures in my perception. It started subtly, a vibration in the air I couldn't place, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath me. The motion-activated cameras blinked at me with indifferent red eyes, but the forest itself seemed alive in ways they could not capture. Low-frequency sounds rolled across the ridge, barely audible yet physiologically undeniable, a hum that made my chest tighten and the hairs on my arms stand on end. I felt watched, not in a fleeting, paranoid sense, but with a deliberate,
patient attentiveness that seemed to come from every shadowed tree line simultaneously. My pulse quickened with each shift in the subtle tremor, and I could feel my body preparing for a predator I could neither see nor understand. It was pareidolia, the rational part of my mind insisted, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns where none exist, but the deeper I ventured, the less satisfying that explanation became. Each rustle of leaves was synchronized with my movements, each snap of a twig coinciding with the direction I glanced. I tried to convince myself these were coincidences, that the forest simply had its own rhythm. Yet the body does not lie. My stomach knotted, my legs tensed, and even my breathing took on the cautious cadence of someone trying to remain invisible. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the brush, the hand-drawn map guiding me toward a feature marked simply as Ruins, Investigate. The path became harder to follow, trees closing in until I was crawling over fallen logs and wading through thick underbrush. The ruins themselves appeared suddenly, an unnatural break in the continuity of the forest. What I found was not listed on any survey, a series of low stone structures half swallowed by moss and soil, angled in ways that made no architectural sense. Some were mere walls, others resembled foundations, but nothing suggested human habitation. No chimneys, no hearths, no artifacts of everyday life, only shapes that implied purpose, but whose function was inscrutable.
I circled the anomalies slowly, taking high-resolution photographs and documenting every angle, every irregularity. The forest seemed to watch, the low hum rising again as if in resonance with my heartbeat. I could feel the vibration in my chest, a rhythm syncing with the unseen intelligence that seemed to move just beyond the tree line. Every step was measured, every breath calculated, because the moment I relaxed, the forest's presence became more pronounced, heavier, almost physical. I set up an array of high-fidelity microphones, placing them at the edges of the clearing, pointed toward the trees where movement seemed most likely. As the day waned, the recordings began to capture what my eyes had been unable to confirm: snaps, shifts, subtle rustlings that mirrored the patterns of my own motion. I reviewed the audio on my laptop, headphones amplifying details normally imperceptible. There was a rhythm to the sounds, almost stalking in nature, pacing around the perimeter, stopping whenever I paused, advancing when I moved. The logical part of my brain screamed for rational explanations: deer, wind, branches, but the body responded differently. The body knew. By late afternoon, shadows lengthened to grotesque angles. Sunlight slanted through the canopy in stripes, illuminating the mossy shapes of the ruins in streaks of green and gold. The anomalies seemed to shift as I moved, subtle changes that defied memory and measurement. It was as if the forest itself was rearranging the ruins to suit my perspective, bending perception in a way that felt intentional. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, though nothing ever emerged. Yet each glance confirmed the same sensation. I was being followed, studied, cataloged by something that was not merely animal, not merely wind or geometry, but aware in a way I could not quantify. My hands shook as I repositioned the microphones, and I realized that the low-frequency hum was rising, swelling into a subtle vibration that penetrated my chest and skull. My legs quivered involuntarily. I had to ground myself against a tree, hands pressed to bark, to remind myself that I was physical, real, and not simply a projection of my own fear. Even so, the instinctual urge to flee was building, a flight or fight response that my rational mind struggled to suppress. Every sound, every snap of twig, every low groan from the underbrush reinforced the idea that I was not alone in this place, and that my aloneness was temporary, conditional, and fragile. As dusk fell, the forest became a tapestry of sound and shadow. The motion-activated cameras blinked intermittently, capturing brief infrared glimpses of shapes moving just beyond the clearing. I reviewed some of the footage on my laptop, heart pounding.
Blurs, quick dashes, forms that vanished before a coherent shape could emerge. The audio and visual data combined created a narrative I could neither explain nor ignore. Snaps in precise sequence, low-frequency hums in resonance with my movements, forms that seemed to adjust to my field of vision. Everything indicated that my presence was acknowledged, reacted to, and perhaps even anticipated. The ruins themselves added to the unease. Some of the stone structures bore markings, faint scratches and patterns that resembled letters or symbols, though I could not identify the language. Others had indentations in the stone that suggested purposeful placement, like slots for objects now lost. I circled them repeatedly, feeling the psychological pressure of observation grow with each pass. Every time I turned my back, I felt the forest's presence in my spine, an acute awareness of being measured and studied. By nightfall, the sensation became almost unbearable. I lit a small lantern, casting a circle of light across the ruins and brush, every flicker exaggerating shadows into elongated, menacing forms. The snaps and rustles circled the light, a rhythm matching the pulses in my chest. I tried to record the sound, positioning my microphones around the perimeter. The playback revealed sequences that were impossible to reconcile with natural causes. Abrupt stops and starts, uneven pacing, subtle timing shifts that suggested intelligence behind the noise. My own movements seemed to trigger responses from an unseen observer, a predator playing a game with rules I could not perceive. I huddled near the center of the clearing, documenting everything in a digital log, voice shaking despite my attempts at calm narration. I described the sounds, the ruins, the shapes, the feeling of being encircled. Every sentence I spoke seemed to echo back at me differently, as if the forest itself was listening, judging, recording. I realized then that my presence here was not an intrusion, it was a negotiation, and the forest would dictate the terms. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow at the edge of the light, every snap, every vibration in the low-frequency hum pulled at my awareness. I could feel my body oscillating between hyper-alertness and exhaustion, an unrelenting physiological response to a predator I could not identify. Even with the cameras and microphones, I was acutely aware that the forest could observe and interact in ways I could not. It was an intelligence without form, without face, yet undeniably present. As I lay awake, listening to the unbroken sequence of hums, snaps, and distant unidentifiable shifts, I understood the core of the dead zones. These were not merely areas without technology or maps. They were environments that tested perception, patience, and sanity. They made your body respond, your mind fracture, your rationality wobble, all while maintaining the ultimate unknowability of the forest's intentions. Every rustle, every vibration, every shadow was a message I could neither read nor ignore. By dawn, I was a hollowed version of myself, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, hands raw from setting up and adjusting cameras and microphones, and ears ringing with frequencies that no human ear should perceive. The recordings captured sequences my mind could not fully comprehend, patterns that suggested intelligence, patience, and deliberation. I had entered the dead pareidolia peak of my journey, the point where human perception meets an intelligence it cannot name, where the forest bends every sense into questioning reality itself. And in that place, I realized, there was no retreat, only observation, endurance, and the fragile hope that I could survive to tell the story.
By the fourth night, I had stopped pretending. The meticulous logs, the careful camera placements, the constant attempts at rational explanations, they had all collapsed under the weight of exhaustion and fear. My eyes felt raw from staring at monitors and shadows alike, my body a tense coil of nerves, and my mind a fragile lattice of paranoia and logic, constantly bending back on itself. I sat in the center of the clearing, camera rolling, knowing that what I was about to say might never be heard by another human being. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, I admitted into the lens, my voice trembling, uneven. I came here thinking I could control this environment, that I could document it and return with evidence. But it's watching. I can feel it. I don't know if it's real or if my mind is finally breaking. But every snap, every rustle, every vibration, like it's synced with me, tells me I am not alone. I shouldn't have come here alone. The words hung in the air, heavy and almost solid. I tried to steady my breathing, but the low-frequency hum had returned, wrapping around me like a tangible current. My hands shook as I reached for a thermos of lukewarm coffee, needing something, anything to remind me that I was still human, still alive. The perimeter alarms, a series of infrared triggers linked to the cameras, suddenly blared in rapid succession. I froze. The feed on the laptop flickered, lights blinking, markers showing movements circling the clearing in a pattern I could not explain. Nothing appeared on the video itself, just the activation of the sensors, the mechanical acknowledgement of motion that wasn't visible. I stood up, chest hammering, flashlight in hand, sweeping the tree line. The forest responded, subtle but undeniable. Leaves shifted where no wind blew. Shadows seemed to fold inward, and the snaps I had been recording for days grew more precise, more deliberate. My logical mind scrambled. Animals, wind, branches. But even as I reasoned, the fight or flight center of my brain screamed that this was something else entirely, something conscious, patient, and calculating. I backed toward the truck, trying to keep the laptop and cameras in view. Every movement felt exaggerated, as if the forest itself measured my balance, my hesitation, my instinct. The alarms continued, cycling at intervals I could not predict. My breath came in short bursts, my vision sharpened, yet the slightest shadow at the edge of the lantern's glow made me flinch. I realized then that I had reached a threshold, the breaking point where human endurance, perception, and paranoia collide. And then, as if mocking my disbelief, the radio sparked to life. A voice, faint, distorted, and impossibly clear for this dead zone, drifted over the frequencies. Fragmented syllables, phrases I could almost but not quite understand. Static hissed around it, and my pulse spiked as I turned the dial. Nothing in the area should have transmitted signals here. No towers, no repeaters, no satellites. Yet there it was, something human-like, or at least mimicking humanity, cutting through the silence I had been navigating for days.
"Hello?" I whispered, gripping the radio like a lifeline. The response was a crackle, then silence, and then a pattern of static snaps synchronized with the camera triggers. My mind refused to frame it as coincidence. Every alarm, every snap, every pulse on the radio felt choreographed, as if the forest itself, or whatever had been watching, was experimenting with communication. My rational mind recoiled. My primal instincts surged. Fight or flight had been tested for days, but now I felt the floodgates open. Every hair on my arm stood at attention. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I ran a perimeter check, moving from camera to camera, flashlight cutting narrow beams into the darkness. Each lens reflected faint infrared glows, but the triggers kept cycling. I could see the markers of movement on the laptop, quantified, recorded, undeniable, but the forest itself offered no explanation. Every shadow seemed alive, every branch seemed poised to snap. I felt trapped between worlds, one of logical understanding, one of raw, instinctual terror, both vying for dominance in my exhausted mind. I crouched behind the truck, taking stock, trying to calm my breathing. The hum was rising again, almost imperceptible at first, then vibrating against my chest and skull like a mechanical pulse in sync with my panic. I realized I was acutely aware of my body in a way I hadn't been in years. Muscles twitching, senses sharpened, my mind hyper-focused on the faintest indication of danger. Every step forward or backward carried weight. Every sound, every movement seemed to ripple outward, measured by an intelligence I could not see. I recorded another entry on the camera, voice ragged. I don't know if what I'm seeing is real. The snaps, the movements, the radio, it shouldn't be possible, but I can't ignore it anymore. It's reacting to me, testing me, waiting. I feel it circling, pacing, watching, and I don't know if I can survive the night. My hands shook as I spoke, the tremor visible even through the lens. I wasn't performing for anyone. I was confessing to the only witness that could capture my vulnerability, the camera, which felt as reliable and as fragile as the fragile thread of my sanity. As the night stretched on, the alarms triggered again, more frequently, more precise. I attempted to retrace my steps, checking each camera. Every time I thought I understood a pattern, it changed, adapting to me. I realized the forest, or whatever entity occupied it, was not passive. It was testing the limits of my awareness, exploiting every lapse in attention, every flicker of fear. The low-frequency hum intertwined with the snaps and the radio static, creating a symphony that the rational brain could not decode.
At some point, exhaustion blurred with terror. I could not differentiate hallucination from reality. Shadows became presences, sounds became threats, and the map, my once trusted guide, felt like an irrelevant relic. I realized that survival here did not depend on preparation alone. It depended on endurance of the mind, on sustaining a fragile balance between reason and instinct when the rules of the world had been rewritten around you. I moved toward the truck again, desperate for any anchor, and paused, listening. The low-frequency hum receded, leaving only the snaps, measured, pacing, deliberate. The alarms blinked across the laptop one after another, as if choreographed by some unseen hand. The radio crackled faintly again, as though testing my attention, teasing, reminding me that I was not alone in this void. My heart raced. I could feel the adrenaline flood through every vein. And in that moment, I understood the essence of the breaking point. It is not a single event, a sudden collapse. It is the accumulation of isolation, exhaustion, and perception twisting in on itself until your body reacts before your mind comprehends. It is the moment where every instinct fires, every shadow becomes real, and every sound, however faint, demands response. Here, in the Appalachian Dead Zones, technology fails, maps mislead, and even reason becomes unreliable. The only certainty is that the forest is aware, reactive, and infinitely patient. I stayed awake that night, moving in cycles between the cameras, the truck, and the small clearing where I had set up my minimal camp. Every snap, every hum, every pulse of the infrared alarms pressed against my senses, reminding me that the boundary between observer and observed had dissolved entirely. I had reached a point where the human mind bends, where perception and reality entangle, and where survival depends not only on preparation, but on a willingness to endure the inexplicable. By the first hint of pre-dawn light, my limbs were trembling, my mind frayed, my senses raw. The forest had tested me, measured me, circled me like a predator studying prey. And though I was still alive, I understood that what I had experienced would remain with me, etched into muscle memory, into the subtle tremor of my heartbeat, into the heightened, impossible awareness of being watched even when nothing appeared to move.
I had crossed into a territory what human comprehension falters, and the breaking point is not a single crack, but a slow, inexorable fracture that leaves you fundamentally changed.
Dawn broke in whispers of pale light, the forest softened by a thin veil of mist that curled around the pines like hesitant smoke. My eyes scanned the clearing, still trembling from the night, and the first sign of movement sent a jolt through my chest, fresh prints in the damped earth. They weren't human, or at least not entirely human. Their shape was vaguely familiar, elongated and uneven, as if the forest itself had left them. I froze, every instinct screaming to retreat, but I had to move. Survival demanded calculation, even when every fiber of my being urged me to flee blindly. I gathered my equipment, cameras and microphones clinking against each other, and retraced the path I had so carefully marked on the hand-drawn map. The trail was treacherous, obscured by fallen branches and mud slick enough to swallow boots. The mist amplified every sound, the drip of dew from the canopy, the distant crack of a snapping branch, the whisper of the wind, as if the forest were breathing around me. My mind, exhausted and frayed, forced me to focus on the tangible: steps, map, compass. One misstep, one hesitation, and the dead zone could claim me again. The forest seemed different in the light. The shadows of night had exaggerated the angles of the trees, the ruins, the underbrush, making them hostile and deliberate. Morning reduced them to ordinary shapes, yet the unease lingered like a phantom. Each ridge I crossed, each stream I passed, I felt the presence that had stalked me in darkness, now retreating subtly, observing from a distance. My breathing steadied, but my awareness never let up. The instinct to survive, honed by fear and exhaustion, kept me scanning, calculating, anticipating. Eventually, the logging trail opened to a faint ridge visible on the map. I paused, knelt, and studied the horizon. Beyond the forest, faint lines of modern life, highways, electrical towers, even the glint of distant rooftops appeared like beacons from another reality. My stomach twisted with relief and disbelief. I wasn't out of the woods yet. The dead zone still had one final test: distance and orientation. One wrong turn could plunge me back into the isolation and unpredictability I had endured. I pressed forward, boots sinking into the softened earth, each step deliberate. The morning mist swirled around me, hiding familiar landmarks until I learned to read them differently, by the shape of a moss-covered log, the slope of a hidden ravine, the smell of damp soil. Every sense was amplified, honed by fear. My heartbeat became a metronome guiding me through the subtle changes in terrain, keeping pace with the rhythm of vigilance the forest had instilled in me. Finally, I reached the point where the dead zone ended and the modern world began. My phone flickered, a tiny, miraculous pulse of connectivity. The screen lit up with the familiar blue glow of satellites locking in, notifications flooding in like a sudden rainstorm after a drought. My hands shook as I touched the icons, calls connecting, messages appearing, GPS recalculating. The sudden rush of digital feedback was overwhelming, the contrast between silence and signal so intense it felt almost violent. I had been living in a world of absence, and the sudden presence of constant communication, light, and sound was almost painful to process. I paused, phone in hand, breathing deeply. The forest behind me was quiet, shrouded in mist, distant and patient. I could feel its weight lingering, an imprint on my body, my senses, my mind. The camera footage, the audio recordings, the maps, they were proof, but proof of what? The mind's capacity for fear, or the tangible intelligence of the Appalachian shadows? I could not say. The dead zones do not provide answers, only experiences that linger, shaping your perception and instincts long after you leave. As I descended the final ridge toward paved roads and civilization, the sensory overload of the modern world assaulted me. The hum of traffic,
the distant roar of engines, the smell of asphalt, the chatter of voices carried on the wind. Each ordinary element, once unnoticed, now felt intense and almost alien. My senses, sharpened for survival, recoiled and adapted simultaneously. I felt raw, stretched between two realities, the patient, observing forest and the structured chaos of the world I thought I had left behind.
I took a moment on the roadside to record one last entry. I don't know if what I experienced was entirely real, I admitted, voice still trembling. But the fear, the vigilance, the impossibility of being truly alone, it wasn't imagined. Whatever was out there, whether the forest itself, some intelligence, or just the echo of my own mind, it tested me in ways I cannot forget. And the truth is, I'm not sure I ever will. Even as the mist receded and sunlight broke fully over the ridges, the lesson remained. The dead zones are not just areas without technology. They are crucibles of perception, endurance, and instinct. They strip away the comfort of connectivity and force you to confront the fragility of your own senses. They remind you that survival is as much about understanding fear as it is about following maps, setting cameras, or listening to recordings. And for me, that lesson will linger forever, etched into muscle memory, in every shadow I perceive, in every low hum or rustle that echoes through my mind. I finally reached the main road, boots muddy, clothes soaked from dew and sweat, but alive. The phone buzzed continuously, GPS tracking, notifications, and the reassuring pulse of a networked world. I glanced back at the forest, now quiet and distant, almost serene in the morning light. But I knew better. The woods had tested me, and their presence remained, a shadow over my perception, a whisper of patience and attention that no distance or signal could erase. The Appalachian Dead Zones are not just uncharted territory. They are living thresholds, spaces where technology fails, reality bends, and instinct becomes the only compass. I had crossed them alone, emerged into the signal, but the experience did not leave me behind. It traveled with me, woven into my thoughts, my nerves, my very understanding of fear. And in the quiet moments, when the world seems ordinary and safe, I can still feel it. The weight of the unseen, the echoes of movement just beyond the edge of perception, and the certainty that the forest remembers.